September 1986. The grand brass doors of Herald Square locked from the inside for the very last time. Inside, longtime employees openly wept as they dismantled bare shelves, selling off display racks and store fixtures for pennies. After 144 years of shaping American retail history, the giant was dead. What giant? At its pinnacle, Gimbel's wasn't just a department store. It was a global retail empire. It boasted the largest retail footprint on Earth, employing tens of thousands and generating $500 million in sales during the mid-20th century. It was an institution so deeply ingrained in the culture that the phrase, "Does Macy's tell Gimbel's?" became a national idiom. Millions tuned in to see their Thanksgiving Day parade, the very first of its kind, and generations of families flocked to their gleaming, bustling aisles every Saturday morning. 3 decades later, the magic had completely evaporated. The majestic flagship buildings went dark, the legendary lunch counters sat abandoned, and the Gimbel's name was quietly erased from the American landscape. Chopped up and sold off in pieces. How does a titan that practically invented modern merchandising vanish without a trace? It wasn't simply because of changing consumer tastes or the inevitable rise of the suburban shopping mall. A toxic cocktail of generational family conflict, a stubborn hesitation to evolve, and a disastrous, soul-crushing corporate takeover by a British tobacco conglomerate ultimately doomed a beloved institution. From an immigrant's humble peddler pack to the center of the world's most famous retail rivalry, this is the story of how an empire forgot its own identity, proving that, in business, heritage alone cannot save you from the future. The year was 1842. In the muddy, bustling frontier town of Vincennes, Indiana, retail was less a structured industry and more a chaotic, daily battle of wits. The prevailing philosophy of the era was caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Every transaction was a tense negotiation, a haggling match where the final price depended entirely on the customer's negotiating skills, their social standing, and the mood of the merchant. There were no price tags, no guarantees, and certainly no refunds. Enter Adam Gimbel. A 25-year-old immigrant from Bavaria, Adam did not arrive in America with a fortune or a grand blueprint for an empire. He began his American journey with a heavy pack strapped to his back, walking the rugged, lonely trails along the Wabash River Valley, peddling notions, thread, and basic necessities to isolated farmers. But Adam possessed a profound, intuitive understanding of human nature and consumer psychology, long before such concepts existed in the corporate lexicon. He recognized a fundamental flaw in the frontier trading system. Haggling bred deep mistrust. It made the act of acquiring goods stressful, inherently antagonistic, and prevented the establishment of long-term customer loyalty. When Adam finally saved enough capital to open his first permanent trading post in Vincennes, he instituted a set of operational rules that were, for the 1840s, nothing short of revolutionary. He boldly posted signs in his modest shop declaring a radical new philosophy: fairness and equality of all patrons, whether they be men, women, or children. He established a strict, non-negotiable one-price policy. A spool of thread cost the exact same amount for a wealthy landowner as it did for a farmer's young child running an errand. Furthermore, he introduced an unheard-of concept to the American frontier: the guarantee. If a customer was dissatisfied with a purchase for any reason, Adam promised a full refund, no questions asked. In modern terms, it was a masterful application of marketing psychology. By entirely removing the friction of negotiation and neutralizing the anxiety of buyer's remorse, Gimbel didn't just sell dry goods. He engineered an environment of absolute trust. Customers no longer felt like they were walking into a combat zone. They felt respected. This psychological shift transformed his humble outpost. The Vincennes store quickly expanded, absorbing neighboring buildings until it became known locally as the Palace of Trade. It evolved into a four-story marvel featuring the region's first plate glass display windows, an early form of visual marketing designed to captivate the eye and encourage impulse buying. Adam Gimbel had effectively transformed the exhausting chore of frontier procurement into an early form of leisure shopping. However, the true legacy of Gimbel's would not be forged by Adam alone, but by his 7 ambitious sons, Jacob, Ellis, Isaac, Charles, Daniel, Louis, and Benedict. Raised among the sprawling aisles of the Vincennes store, the Gimbel brothers inherited their father's acute business acumen, but harbored visions that stretched far beyond the banks of the Wabash River. As the late 19th century approached, the American landscape was undergoing a seismic shift. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and railroads were aggressively crisscrossing the continent, moving goods and people at unprecedented speeds. The brothers watched this transformation with keen interest. They looked at their thriving Indiana operation and realized a stark truth. A frontier town, no matter how prosperous, had a permanent ceiling. The real wealth, the explosive consumer demand, and the absolute future of American retail were rapidly concentrating in the booming, densely populated metropolises of the East. By the 1880s, the tension within the Gimbel family was palpable. The sons respected their father's creation, but they felt constricted. They saw the staggering fortunes being amassed by visionary merchants in Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York. They knew with absolute certainty that their father's core principles, radical honesty, fixed prices, and high-volume sales, were perfectly scalable. If they could win over the cautious, pragmatic farmers of Indiana, they believed they could conquer the sophisticated, trend-hungry shoppers of the Eastern Seaboard. Adam Gimbel, the pragmatic pioneer, eventually recognized the undeniable logic of his son's ambitions. He had built a secure fortress, but his sons wanted to rule an empire. The monumental decision was made to look eastward. They would leave behind the safety of their undisputed dominance in Vincennes to plunge directly into the most cutthroat retail markets in the country. The peddler's dream had matured. It was now time to build the palaces. The transition from a successful regional merchant to a national powerhouse required a staggering amount of capital and an even greater reserve of sheer audacity. The Gimbel brothers knew that to capture the imagination of the American public, they could no longer just build stores, they had to build destinations. The era of the grand department store was dawning, and the brothers intended to be its chief architects. Their eastward march began with a strategic stepping stone. In 1887, they opened a highly successful multi-story emporium in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, proving that their father's principles could thrive in a major industrial hub. But the true test of their ambition came in 1894 when they bypassed other Midwestern cities and leaped directly into the heart of the East Coast establishment, Philadelphia. The Philadelphia store was a revelation. It was not merely a place to acquire goods, it was a meticulously curated experience. The brothers understood that the rapidly expanding middle class possessed disposable income and a deep desire for upward mobility. They designed their Philadelphia location to reflect these aspirations. Shoppers were greeted by gleaming mahogany display cases, imported marble floors, and an army of impeccably dressed clerks trained to treat every customer like royalty. The success was absolute and immediate, cementing Gimbel's as a formidable force in Eastern retail. Yet for Isaac Gimbel, the brother who increasingly drove the company's aggressive expansion strategy, Philadelphia was merely a rehearsal. The ultimate prize, the undisputed capital of American commerce, was New York City. In 1910, Gimbel's made its most audacious move yet. They did not just quietly enter the New York market. They announced their arrival with an architectural marvel that commanded the city's attention. they constructed a breathtaking 1 million square foot flagship store at Greeley Square, directly intersecting with Herald Square. The location choice was a masterstroke of urban planning and infrastructure integration. The massive building was intricately connected to the city's subterranean lifeblood, featuring direct underground passageways to the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, now the PATH train, and the newly constructed Pennsylvania Station. A shopper from New Jersey could literally step off a train and walk directly into the basement of Gimbel's without ever feeling a drop of rain or seeing the New York sky. Stepping onto the main floor of the New York flagship was designed to be an overwhelming sensory experience. The ceilings soared high above, suspended by ornate columns. A complex network of brass pneumatic tubes hissed and hummed throughout the building, whisking cash and receipts between the sales floors and the central accounting office at lightning speed. Elevators, operated by uniformed attendants with white gloves, ferried thousands of awestruck shoppers up through floors dedicated to everything from Parisian fashions to imported European furniture, rare books, and fine dining. It was a self-contained universe of consumerism. Gimbel's had successfully transformed the act of buying from a chore into a highly anticipated leisure activity. But their genius extended far beyond the physical architecture. The Gimbel brothers were pioneers of public relations and civic spectacle. They understood that to weave their brand into the fabric of American life, they needed to own the cultural calendar. In 1920, Ellis Gimbel orchestrated a brilliant marketing maneuver in Philadelphia that would forever change American holidays. He organized a procession of store employees dressed in costumes, accompanied by a marching band and concluding with the arrival of Santa Claus, to entertain the city's children. It was the very first Thanksgiving Day parade. While a rival store in New York would later adopt and popularize the concept on a grander scale, it was Gimbel's who invented the tradition, forever linking their name with the magic of the holiday shopping season. By the end of the 1910s, Gimbel's was operating on a scale that Adam Gimbel could scarcely have imagined while walking the muddy trails of the Wabash River. They were no longer merchants. They were retail royalty, presiding over palaces of commerce that dictated fashion and lifestyle trends for millions. However, the location of their magnificent New York flagship was no accident. Isaac Gimbel had deliberately chosen to build his monument to retail at 33rd Street and Broadway. Just one block north, at 34th Street, stood the massive flagship of another retail titan, Macy's. Gimbel's had not just arrived in New York. They had intentionally parked their tanks on the lawn of the biggest, most aggressive competitor in the world. The proximity was a bold, unmistakable declaration of war, setting the stage for the most famous, bitter, and culturally defining rivalry in the history of American business. To understand the retail landscape of New York City in the first half of the 20th century, one must envision a theater of war where the battlegrounds were polished aisles, the weapons were full-page newspaper advertisements, and the ultimate prize was the discretionary income of the American middle class. At the dead center of this conflict stood two colossal fortresses, separated by a single city block, Macy's at 34th Street and Gimbel's at 33rd. This geographic proximity was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate provocation by Isaac Gimbel. By planting his million-square-foot flagship literally in the shadow of the world's largest store, he guaranteed that the two companies would be locked in a perpetual, exhausting, and highly lucrative struggle for dominance. Throughout the 1920s and into the Great Depression, the Macy's-Gimbel's rivalry transcended mere business competition. It became a defining spectator sport for the citizens of New York. Every single morning before the heavy brass doors were unlocked to the public, an invisible army of retail spies was deployed. Macy's comparative shoppers would covertly roam the floors of Gimbel's, furiously scribbling down prices on everything from silk stockings to kitchen appliances. Simultaneously, Gimbels' scouts were doing the exact same thing a block north. If Macy's dropped the price of a toaster by 2 cents, Gimbels would adjust their signage within the hour. It was a ruthless game of margin manipulation designed to win the psychological war of being the absolute cheapest option in town. The conflict spilled out of the stores and onto the broadsheets. The two retail leviathans regularly engaged in passive-aggressive advertising wars in the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, indirectly mocking each other's inventory and making grandiose claims of superiority. This fierce, highly publicized antagonism seeped so deeply into the public consciousness that it birthed a national idiom. When someone was asked a probing question or pressed to reveal a secret, the standard street-smart deflection became, "Does Macy's tell Gimbels?" The phrase was a cultural shorthand for the ultimate, impenetrable trade secret. It was a testament to how universally recognized the feud had become. During this golden era, Gimbels was operating at an unimaginable scale. The New York flagship alone employed over 5,000 people during the holiday rush. They maintained massive off-site warehouses just to hold the overflow of inventory. They sold live exotic pets, fine art, imported European antiques, and the latest consumer appliances. On a busy Saturday, hundreds of thousands of people would flow through the turnstiles of the underground transit stations directly into the Gimbels' basement, creating a deafening roar of commerce that echoed all the way to the executive offices on the top floor. The cultural saturation of Gimbels reached its absolute zenith in the winter of 1947, immortalized on celluloid in the classic holiday film, Miracle on 34th Street. The movie's entire comedic and emotional premise hinged on the legendary animosity between the two retail giants. When the Macy's Santa Claus, claiming to be the real Kris Kringle, directs a stressed mother to go to Gimbels to find a sold-out toy, it is treated as a shocking, scandalous act of corporate treason. The film brilliantly captured the public perception of the rivalry. More importantly, it showcased Gimbels not just as a store, but as an essential, immovable pillar of American holiday tradition. The real-life executives of both companies, including the charismatic Bernard Gimbel, recognized the unprecedented marketing value of the film and fully cooperated with the production. When the movie became a massive commercial and critical success, it served as an hour-and-a-half-long, internationally distributed advertisement for the Gimbels brand. In the immediate post-World War II years, the balance sheets reflected this cultural dominance. The company was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. They had expanded their empire, acquiring the prestigious Saks Fifth Avenue brand to capture the ultra-luxury market while maintaining the Gimbels name for the high-volume, middle-class shopper. By 1950, Gimbel Brothers Inc. was a retail titan without equal, boasting the largest collective retail floor space of any company on the planet. But within the quiet, mahogany-paneled boardrooms overlooking Greeley Square, a dangerous psychological shift was occurring. The intoxicating combination of record-breaking profits and Hollywood immortality had bred a subtle, yet fatal, strain of corporate hubris. The third generation of the Gimbel family, now comfortably holding the reins of the empire, looked down at the swarms of shoppers fighting for space on the main floor and made a critical miscalculation. They conflated the temporary euphoria of the post-war economic boom with permanent consumer loyalty. Because they had built palaces, they simply assumed the public would always make the pilgrimage to worship at their counters. They believed that the sheer gravity of the Gimbels name was enough to command the market. Intoxicated by the success of their massive downtown flagships, the leadership became strategically nearsighted. As they focused entirely on their ongoing block-by-block war with Macy's, they failed to notice that the battlefield itself was about to move. A quiet, profound demographic revolution was beginning at the edges of the city limits, a revolution that would soon render their magnificent urban fortresses obsolete. When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, the United States experienced an unprecedented economic and demographic explosion that would permanently alter the physical landscape of the country. Millions of soldiers returned home, armed with the GI Bill, eager to start families and claim their share of the American dream. This dream, however, no longer featured a cramped, noisy apartment in the dense urban cores of New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago. It looked like a detached, single-family home with a manicured lawn, a white picket fence, and, crucially, a driveway. The 1950s birthed the Great American Suburb. Sprawling developments like Levittown transformed former potato fields into massive, organized grids of domestic tranquility. Simultaneously, the federal government began laying the groundwork for the interstate highway system. The automobile rapidly transitioned from a luxury item to an absolute necessity for the new modern family. For the retail industry, this demographic earthquake represented an existential crossroads. The traditional model of American shopping relied entirely on centralized downtown hubs. For decades, the consumer came to the store, usually via an intricate network of subways, streetcars, and commuter trains. But as the middle class fled the cities for the quiet cul-de-sacs of the suburbs, a radical new concept emerged. The store had to go to the consumer. Pioneering real estate developers began paving over massive tracts of cheap suburban land to construct open-air shopping centers surrounded by acres of free parking. By the mid-1950s, this evolved into the concept of the enclosed shopping mall, a climate-controlled, idealized ecosystem of commerce where a family could spend an entire Saturday without ever setting foot on a gritty city sidewalk or enduring a sweltering subway commute. Inside the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of Gimbels, however, the executives suffered from a fatal case of urban myopia. The leadership, now firmly in the hands of a third generation raised in immense wealth and urban privilege, looked out from their towering downtown flagships and fundamentally misunderstood the suburban phenomenon. To them, the suburbs were an endless sea of identical, sterile houses, devoid of culture. They possessed a deep, institutional arrogance, born from decades of dominating Herald Square and downtown Philadelphia. They genuinely believed that their stores were the undeniable centers of the retail universe. When presented with the opportunity to build smaller, suburban branch locations in these new, unproven shopping centers, the Gimbels board hesitated. Their reasoning was steeped in a dangerous blend of pride and financial caution. Why, they argued, should they spend millions of dollars building a watered-down version of Gimbels in a muddy parking lot in New Jersey or Long Island? They feared that opening suburban branches would only cannibalize the sales of their magnificent downtown flagships. Furthermore, they stubbornly clung to the belief that the sheer gravitational pull of the Gimbels brand was strong enough to overcome the inconvenience of travel. They assumed that the suburban housewife, when she wanted a new coat or needed to buy Christmas presents, would happily endure the hour-long commute back into the city to experience the real Gimbels. It was a catastrophic miscalculation of consumer psychology. The new suburban reality prized convenience above all else. Driving a station wagon to a local mall with free parking and pushing a stroller through wide, climate-controlled corridors was infinitely more appealing than navigating a crowded train with heavy shopping bags. While Gimbels debated and delayed, their competitors were aggressively carving up the map. Macy's, Sears, and JCPenney recognized that the mall was the undisputed future of American retail. They actively partnered with ambitious real estate developers, signing lucrative long-term leases to become the highly coveted anchor tenants of the nation's first mega malls. By committing early, these rivals secured the absolute best real estate, the prime locations situated directly off the new highway exits, surrounded by the fastest-growing residential neighborhoods. By the time the reality of the suburban shift finally pierced the boardroom at Gimbels, the golden window of opportunity had slammed shut. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, A panicked Gimbel's leadership finally initiated a delayed, desperate expansion into the suburbs. But they were moving into a battlefield that had already been conquered. The premier A-tier malls were already anchored by their rivals. Developers no longer needed Gimbel's to legitimize their projects. Forced to play catch-up, Gimbel's had to settle for B-tier locations, smaller shopping centers, less affluent demographic areas, or geographically awkward plots of land that lacked the foot traffic of the premier destinations. This hesitation marked the first major structural crack in the empire. For the first time in their century-long history, Gimbel's was no longer the innovator dictating the terms of the market. They were a reactive secondary player, scrambling for leftovers. The suburban shift exposed a terrifying truth. The towering downtown palaces that had built the Gimbel family fortune were slowly transforming from vital assets into massive, expensive liabilities. The battle for the American consumer had moved, and Gimbel's had missed the train. As the turbulent 1960s gave way to the economically stagnant 1970s, the American retail ecosystem underwent a brutal, unforgiving evolution. The market was violently splitting in two distinct directions. On one end of the spectrum, aggressive, no-frills discounters like Kmart and Walmart were quietly building massive logistical empires, optimizing supply chains to offer consumers rock-bottom prices. On the other end, higher-income shoppers were migrating toward highly curated, specialized boutiques and elevated department stores that offered a premium, aspirational lifestyle. Gimbel's found itself completely paralyzed, trapped in the absolute most dangerous territory in modern commerce, the unremarkable middle. They were no longer cheap enough to attract the bargain hunter, yet their stores had grown far too shabby to retain the luxury shopper. They were suffering from a terminal identity crisis. The root of this paralysis could be traced directly to the executive suites, where the unified, aggressive vision of Adam Gimbel's original 7 sons had thoroughly fractured. By the late 1960s, the company was being managed by the third and fourth generations of the Gimbel family, primarily under the leadership of Bruce Gimbel. While previous generations lived and breathed the granular details of merchandising, the newer leadership viewed the empire less as a calling and more as a massive inherited bureaucracy. The familial passion that had fueled the Great Expansion had cooled into a conservative, risk-averse corporate culture. Board meetings devolved into prolonged debates over minor operational budgets rather than bold strategies for the future. This internal stagnation manifested physically within the stores themselves. The legendary downtown flagships, once hailed as the magnificent palaces of commerce, were aging, and they were aging badly. Maintaining a 1,000,000-square-foot urban facility requires constant, massive capital reinvestment, something the hesitant Gimbel board was increasingly reluctant to authorize. The sensory experience of shopping at Gimbel's, once a carefully engineered psychological trigger for joy and consumption, steadily eroded into something deeply depressing. Customers who remembered the gleaming marble floors and meticulous displays of the 1930s now walked into cavernous halls illuminated by flickering, harsh fluorescent lighting. The grand architectural details were obscured by cheap dropped ceilings. The merchandise, rather than being artfully curated, was often haphazardly piled onto scuffed, outdated fixtures. The once immaculate visual branding had deteriorated into a chaotic, uninspiring aesthetic that actively repelled the modern consumer. Just one block north at 34th Street, their historic rival was aggressively adapting. Macy's was investing heavily in youthful fashion trends, modernizing its floor layouts, and leaning into vibrant, theatrical visual merchandising to capture the baby boomer generation. In stark contrast, Gimbel's felt like a museum of a bygone era. Their attempts to attract younger demographics with hip clothing departments were painfully transparent and poorly executed, feeling completely out of place against the backdrop of peeling paint and outdated decor. The famous question, "Does Macy's tell Gimbel's?" took on a cruel, ironic new meaning. Macy's didn't need to tell Gimbels anything. The market had already spoken, and Gimbels simply wasn't listening. Even the legendary customer service, the very foundation of Adam Gimbel's original frontier success, began to collapse. To cut costs, management reduced floor staff and relied heavily on part-time workers who lacked the deep product knowledge and institutional pride of the career clerks who had built the company's reputation. A customer navigating the cluttered, confusing aisles of the Herald Square store might wander for 20 minutes before finding an exhausted employee to ring up a purchase. The psychological contract between the brand and the buyer was broken. Gimbels had entirely lost its grasp on consumer psychology. They were no longer telling a compelling story or offering a cohesive identity. When a shopper walked into a competitor's store, they knew exactly what they were getting. When they walked into Gimbels, they felt only a lingering sense of institutional fatigue. The brand simply blended into the background noise of the city, becoming a place people walked through to get somewhere else, rather than a destination in itself. Financially, this apathy was disastrous. The massive overhead costs of the decaying urban flagships, combined with the underperforming, poorly located suburban branches, created a lethal drain on the company's capital. Profit margins razor-thinned and then vanished entirely. The company began bleeding millions of dollars annually just to keep the lights on and the escalators running. By the early 1970s, the tension within the Gimbel family reached a breaking point. The financial burden of modernization was astronomical, and the collective will to fight a multi-front war against both modern discounters and high-end rivals simply did not exist. The emotional toll of presiding over the slow, humiliating decay of their grandfather's legacy was too heavy. In 1973, facing a bleak balance sheet and a total lack of strategic direction, the Gimbel family made a quiet, agonizing decision. They surrendered. They agreed to relinquish control of the empire that had defined their family for over a century. The business was put up for sale, opening the door for an acquisition that would not save the company, but rather strip away its remaining soul. By 1973, the internal exhaustion within the Gimbel family had reached a critical mass. The burden of sustaining a century-old legacy in a rapidly evolving, increasingly hostile retail environment had simply become too heavy. The descendants of Adam Gimbel, facing mounting operational costs and a paralyzing inability to define their brand's future, made the agonizing decision to surrender the empire. The family business, built from a single frontier trading post into a national institution, was placed on the auction block. The buyer that emerged from the corporate landscape was not a rival department store chain, nor was it a consortium of seasoned retail executives. In a move that perfectly encapsulated the bizarre corporate conglomeration trends of the 1970s, Gimbels was acquired by Betis Inc., the American subsidiary of British American Tobacco. The news sent shockwaves through the retail industry. A multinational behemoth whose primary expertise lay in the mass production and global distribution of cigarettes, had just purchased one of America's most storied department store chains. The underlying corporate logic for Betis was simple diversification. Tobacco companies in the 70s were flush with cash, but increasingly wary of looming government regulations and shifting public health perceptions regarding smoking. They sought to park their massive profits into stable, established non-tobacco American assets. Crucially, however, Betis's primary target in the acquisition was not the ailing Gimbels brand itself. The true prize was Saks Fifth Avenue, the highly lucrative, ultra-luxury retail brand that the Gimbel brothers had acquired decades earlier. Saks was a prestigious cash cow. Gimbels, by comparison, was the massive, unwieldy, and problematic entity attached to the deal. In the eyes of the new corporate ownership, Gimbels was essentially an inherited headache, a sprawling network of decaying urban flagships and underperforming suburban branches that came as part of a package deal. The cultural clash between the new ownership and the legacy institution was immediate and catastrophic. The soul of a great department store relies entirely on the instincts of its merchants, the buyers, and floor managers who possess an intuitive, almost artistic understanding of consumer aspiration, seasonal fashion trends, and local community tastes. Selling fashion and home goods is an emotional transaction. British American Tobacco, conversely, operated on a philosophy of rigid standardization and high-volume logistics. They were accustomed to manufacturing a uniform, addictive product that required zero emotional curation on the sales floor. When they applied this monolithic, industrialized mindset to the aisles of Gimbels, the results were disastrous. The executives sent down from corporate headquarters did not walk the sales floors. They managed the stores from spreadsheets. They replaced the seasoned, intuitive buyers with corporate analysts who prioritized safe, predictable profit margins over bold merchandising. The art of retail was rapidly replaced by the cold, unforgiving science of inventory management. To their credit, Betis did attempt to stop the bleeding. They injected millions of dollars into the Gimbels infrastructure, authorizing long-overdue renovations for several of the aging downtown locations and attempting to streamline the chaotic supply chains. But this capital infusion was purely cosmetic and entirely devoid of brand vision. The renovation scrubbed away whatever unique, historical charm remained in the stores, replacing ornate fixtures with generic, sterile corporate aesthetics designed to minimize maintenance costs. The stores didn't feel revitalized. They felt institutionalized. Furthermore, the strict financial mandates from the tobacco executives handcuffed the purchasing departments. Instructed to avoid risk and focus on high-margin, middle-of-the-road goods, Gimbel's inventory became aggressively mediocre. At a time when consumers were demanding either the deep discounts of Kmart or the specialized high-fashion curation of blooming boutiques, Gimbel's filled its massive floor space with oceans of beige sweaters, uninspired housewares, and safe, forgettable apparel. They offered no compelling reason for a shopper to enter the store. The most profound casualty of the tobacco takeover, however, was the human element. The veteran employees, the floor clerks, the window dressers, and the department managers who had spent their entire careers building the Gimbels community felt entirely alienated by the new regime. The familial pride that had once held the company together through economic depressions and world wars evaporated. They were no longer working for a retail dynasty. They were anonymous line items on the balance sheet of a foreign conglomerate that fundamentally did not understand what they did. By the end of the 1970s, the illusion that Betis could successfully manage a mid-tier department store had completely shattered. The corporate homogenization had successfully excised the last remnants of the Gimbel family soul, leaving behind a hollow shell of a brand. The massive cash injections had failed to generate customer loyalty, and as a brutal economic recession loomed on the horizon, the spreadsheets that the new executives worshipped began to reveal a terrifying, undeniable reality. The empire wasn't just struggling anymore, it was hemorrhaging money at a fatal rate. The dawn of the 1980s brought a harsh and unforgiving economic reality to the United States. A bruising combination of double-digit inflation, energy crises, and a deep national recession effectively suffocated the discretionary income of the American middle class. As families tightened their belts, the retail landscape violently reacted to this economic pressure, permanently altering how and where Americans chose to spend their money. The market was rapidly and decisively bifurcating. On one end of the spectrum, the relentless expansion of discount giants like Kmart, Walmart, and Target offered economically strained consumers a lifeline. These massive, efficiently run, single-level stores in the suburbs provided household necessities at rock-bottom prices. On the other end of the spectrum, a new phenomenon was dominating the enclosed shopping malls: the specialty retailer. Stores like The Gap, The Limited, and Foot Locker captured the youth and fashion markets by offering highly curated, specific identities. malls had evolved into vibrant, neon-lit social hubs, featuring food courts, multiplex cinemas, and endless entertainment options. Gimbels was completely stranded in the absolute dead center of this retail spectrum, the most dangerous territory in modern commerce. They lacked the sophisticated supply chains and massive volume required to compete with the aggressive pricing of the discounters. Simultaneously, their aging, generalized merchandise could not compete with the sharp, trendy appeal of the mall-based specialty boutiques. They were a store that sold everything, but nothing that anyone desperately wanted or needed. The physical state of the Gimbel stores, particularly the historic downtown flagships, reflected this profound identity crisis. The million-square-foot palaces in New York, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh that had once defined American retail grandeur were now massive, decaying albatrosses. Maintaining these colossal, multi-story buildings required immense, constant capital reinvestment, capital that Betis, the parent company, was increasingly unwilling to provide. The upper floors of many locations were quietly closed off to the public to save on electricity and staffing, gathering dust in the dark. The remaining sales floors were a depressing mix of burned-out fluorescent bulbs, scuffed linoleum, and outdated fixtures. The sensory experience of shopping at Gimbel's, once a joyous event, had become an exercise in institutional melancholy. The financial reality of this stagnation was catastrophic. By the early 1980s, the Gimbel's division was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. It wasn't merely a matter of shrinking profit margins. The stores were actively operating at massive millions of dollars per year losses. Operating huge urban flagships meant enduring skyrocketing property taxes, staggering utility bills, and complex unionized labor costs, all while the critical metric of sales per square foot plummeted to industry lows. The magnificent buildings that had built the Gimbel family fortune had transformed into giant, gaping wounds on the Betis corporate balance sheet. In a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, the corporate executives initiated a series of panicked, reactionary strategies. They attempted to pivot the brand, launching expensive new advertising campaigns aimed at capturing the rising demographic of professional working women. They tried to modernize the apparel departments, awkwardly shoving contemporary fashion displays into the decaying, dimly lit corners of the old stores. They slashed prices on major appliances and furniture, inadvertently sparking disastrous price wars that only further eroded their profit margins without generating long-term customer loyalty. But the American consumer is highly perceptive. A glossy new advertising slogan could not mask the peeling paint, the broken escalators, or the fundamentally disjointed shopping experience. The brand had entirely lost its cultural authority. When shoppers thought of Gimbel's, they no longer conjured images of the glorious Thanksgiving Day parade, the gleaming brass elevators, or the intense, thrilling rivalry with Macy's. They thought of a place that felt tired, chaotic, and fundamentally sad. Gimbel's had become the store of last resort. The psychological toll on the remaining workforce was equally devastating. The veteran employees, some of whom had spent 3 decades walking the floors of Herald Square, watched helplessly as the institution they loved was slowly dismantled by corporate apathy. They were forced to deal with frustrated customers, broken equipment, and an ever-shrinking inventory of mediocre goods. The pride of wearing a Gimbel's name tag was replaced by the constant, looming anxiety of impending layoffs. They knew, long before the executives in London would admit it, that the ship was taking on water faster than it could be bailed out. By 1985, the patience of the British tobacco executives at BATUS had completely evaporated. They looked at their broader American retail portfolio with cold, calculated pragmatism. Saks Fifth Avenue, the luxury crown jewel they had acquired alongside Gimbel's, was generating spectacular, reliable profits. Marshall Field's, another legendary department store chain they had recently purchased, was holding its ground in the Midwest. Gimbel's, however, was a financial black hole, a toxic asset threatening to drag down the entire retail division. The spreadsheets no longer justified patience, and the corporate board had no sentimental attachment to the legacy of Adam Gimbel. They reached a brutal, inescapable conclusion. The brand was terminally ill. The millions of dollars in losses could no longer be subsidized. The decision was quietly finalized in the corporate boardrooms. The mighty Gimbel's empire could not be saved. It had to be amputated. The only remaining question was how to dispose of the massive, sprawling carcass. January 1986 arrived with a bitter chill across the Northeast, but the coldest reality was quietly unfolding inside the corporate offices of Betis Inc. After years of subsidizing the massive, bleeding wound that the Gimbel's division had become, the British tobacco conglomerate finally made the formal announcement that the retail world had long anticipated. The entire chain, comprising 36 stores across New York, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, was officially up for sale. The initial press releases were couched in the standard, sanitized language of corporate restructuring. BATUS executives claimed they were simply refocusing their American portfolio to concentrate on highly profitable, upscale assets like Saks Fifth Avenue and Marshall Fields. They expressed public optimism that a willing buyer would swoop in to acquire the Gimbel's chain intact, preserving the historic brand, maintaining the community presence, and saving thousands of jobs. But within the insulated, cutthroat circles of American retail executives, this optimism was recognized for exactly what it was: a desperate, transparent bluff. The brutal truth was that absolutely nobody wanted to buy Gimbel's in 1986. The era of the sprawling, mid-market, multi-level urban department store was rapidly drawing to a close. The retail industry had thoroughly analyzed the Gimbel's portfolio and recoiled at the sheer scale of the liability. The physical infrastructure of the flagship locations was severely compromised by decades of deferred maintenance. The plumbing networks were ancient, the electrical grids were woefully outdated, and the sheer square footage of the buildings made them impossibly expensive to heat, cool, and staff. To bring these colossal structures up to modern retail standards would require hundreds of millions of dollars in capital investment, money that no sane corporation was willing to sink into a deeply damaged, culturally exhausted brand. Furthermore, the suburban branch locations were largely situated in secondary, aging malls that were already losing foot traffic to newer, more dynamic enclosed shopping centers. Gimbel's was a dinosaur hopelessly trapped in a tar pit, and the corporate predators circling above had no intention of saving the beast. They only wanted to pick the bones clean. For several agonizing months, Betis desperately shopped the company around. They held clandestine meetings with rival department store executives, aggressive commercial real estate developers, and corporate liquidators. But the verdict from the market was unanimous. The Gimbel's name, once the proudest banner in American commerce and a staple of Hollywood folklore, held absolutely zero equity. The tragic irony of the century-old empire was undeniable. The only things of worth remaining were the physical suburban leases and the dirt beneath the downtown stores. By June of 1986, the inevitable could no longer be delayed. Finding no single savior willing to shoulder the massive operational burden, Betis fundamentally changed their strategy. If they could not sell the empire whole, they would slaughter it and sell off the parts. A formal, final declaration was issued to the press. The 36 remaining Gimbel stores would be permanently closed and liquidated. The company would be chopped up piece by piece and sold to the highest bidders. The announcement sent a profound shockwave through the cities where Gimbel's had operated for generations. In New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Milwaukee, the news dominated the evening broadcasts and the front pages of the morning papers. For millions of Americans, the realization that Gimbel's was actually going to disappear was deeply disorienting. It was as if someone had abruptly announced the demolition of a beloved permanent civic monument. Even those who hadn't shopped at the store in over a decade felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss. Gimbel's had been a constant, reassuring presence in the background of their lives. The place where they had bought their first winter coats, where they had marveled at the spectacular Christmas window displays, and where they had eaten countless Saturday lunches at the bustling basement counters. For the loyal employees, however, the news was not merely nostalgic. It was a devastating personal crisis. Thousands of workers, many of whom were in their 50s and 60s, and had dedicated their entire adult lives to walking those polished floors, were suddenly handed termination notices. They were informed that their pensions would be honored, but their daily livelihoods and their community were finished. The familial bond that Adam Gimbel had forged on the frontier a century earlier was officially severed by a boardroom spreadsheet thousands of miles away. Almost immediately, the corporate vultures descended. Rival chains, including the fierce, historic enemy just one block north, began aggressively negotiating to take over the most viable suburban leases. Real estate developers bought the rights to the massive downtown buildings with plans to gut them entirely. As the oppressive summer heat settled over the cities, the final humiliation began. Massive, garish yellow banners were draped across the elegant limestone facades of the flagship stores, screaming, "Store closing," and "Everything must go." The majestic palaces of commerce, which had once dictated global fashion and commanded the respect of millions, were transformed overnight into chaotic, bargain basement flea markets. The Death Watch had officially begun, setting the stage for one of the most melancholic and surreal final chapters in the history of American retail. Summer gave way to the crisp autumn of 1986, but the atmosphere inside the remaining Gimbel stores was anything but seasonal. There was no quiet anticipation of the upcoming holidays, no meticulous planning for the legendary Thanksgiving window displays, and no training seminars for the usual influx of seasonal hires. Instead, the final months of Gimbel's were an agonizing, chaotic exercise in corporate dismantling. The liquidation process, managed by ruthless outside firms specializing in retail autopsies, was brutally efficient and entirely devoid of sentimentality. The glorious Herald Square location in New York, along with the massive flagships in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, were systematically stripped of their remaining dignity. Garish yellow and black banners screaming "Everything must go," "All sales final," and "Fixtures for sale" were plastered haphazardly over the elegant limestone facades and polished brass entryways. The sophisticated visual merchandising that had once defined the Gimbel brothers' empire was replaced by the chaotic, humiliating aesthetics of a massive indoor garage sale. Floor by floor, the giant stores were condensed. As merchandise was sold off at increasingly desperate discounts, 40%, then 60%, then 80% off, the upper levels were cleared out, plunged into darkness, and chained shut. The remaining inventory was shoved onto the lower floors in a haphazard, depressing jumble. Fine imported china was stacked precariously next to discounted athletic socks and broken plastic toys. High-end winter coats were piled onto cheap folding tables like thrift store discards. The air inside the stores literally changed. The familiar, comforting scent of expensive cosmetics and polished leather on the main floors was slowly replaced by the dry smell of dust, empty cardboard boxes, and industrial floor wax. The customer base during these final weeks shifted dramatically. The loyal, multi-generational shoppers who had sustained the brand for decades largely stayed away. For them, it was simply too painful to walk through the doors and witness the physical desecration of their childhood memories. In their place arrived the liquidator crowds, a swarm of pragmatic, aggressive bargain hunters who had absolutely no emotional attachment to the name on the building. They picked through the remains with clinical detachment, haggling with exhausted clerks over slightly damaged goods, stained shirts, and scuffed shoes. For the veteran employees, this prolonged death watch was the ultimate indignity. Men and women who had spent 20, 30, or even 40 years carefully folding displays, advising on luxury cosmetics, and taking immense pride in the Gimbel's standard of service were now reduced to the roles of glorified security guards and warehouse sweepers. They wore their classic name tags like badges of mourning. Many wept openly in the employee break rooms during their lunch hours. They weren't just losing a reliable paycheck. They were losing a tight-knit community, a lifelong daily routine, and a significant piece of their personal identities. The corporate executives across the Atlantic had casually severed the head of the company on a spreadsheet, but it was the floor workers in America who were forced to stand helpless as the body bled out in front of them. As September drew to a close, the final days arrived. While the exact closing dates varied slightly across the doomed portfolio of 36 locations, the atmosphere of the terminal hour was universally somber. At the Herald Square flagship, the crowds that gathered outside on the final weekend were not there to shop. There was practically nothing left to buy. They were there to bear witness and pay their final respects to a fallen monument. Inside, the cavernous million-square-foot building felt incredibly hollow. The vast majority of the store's physical infrastructure had already been sold off. The heavy mahogany display cases, the stylized mannequins, the cash registers, and even the heavy metal clothing racks had been tagged with numbered stickers and hauled away by liquidators and rival business owners. All that remained were naked floors, speckled with debris, exposed electrical wires, and the eerie, echoing sounds of a century of commerce bouncing off the high, empty ceilings. In the final hours, the mood on the main floor shifted from frantic retail chaos to a heavy, funereal silence. Customers wandered the few remaining open aisles, taking photographs with flash cameras, desperately trying to capture the fading ghosts of the building. They stared at the empty spaces where the legendary lunch counters used to serve thousands of sandwiches a day. They shared emotional memories with the exhausted clerks, stories of meeting the real Santa Claus in 1954, of buying a wedding dress in 1962, of the sheer, overwhelming magic of a Gimbel's Saturday morning when the aisles were so packed you could barely move. Cashiers processed the very last transactions, a deeply discounted scarf, a mismatched set of water glasses, a solitary display hanger, with tears streaming freely down their faces. When the final hour finally struck, the store managers, their voices cracking with uncharacteristic emotion, picked up the microphones to make the very last public address announcements. The audio crackled through the aging speakers one last time. They thanked the generations of customers for their unwavering loyalty. They thanked the staff for their resilience and dedication through the darkest, most difficult years. And then, with a heavy sigh, they politely asked the remaining patrons to make their final way to the exits. The physical act of closing the doors was profoundly symbolic. At Herald Square, the heavy brass portals that had welcomed millions, the very doors that had stood as a defiant, permanent challenge to Macy's just one block north, were slowly pulled shut from the inside. The heavy deadbolts engaged with a loud, definitive click. The lights in the great display windows, which had once stopped pedestrian traffic with their mechanical holiday wonders, were switched off, plunging the glass into darkness. 76 years after Isaac Gimbel boldly invaded New York City, and 144 years after Adam Gimbel first strapped a peddler's pack to his back in the mud of Indiana, the empire was officially dead. The great American retail rivalry was over. Macy's had won the war, but as the executives looked south from 34th Street at the darkened, lifeless silhouette of their fallen adversary, the victory felt entirely hollow. Gimbel's had not just been a competitor, it had been an essential counterweight in the ecosystem of American consumer culture. Its sudden, violent absence left a massive, gaping void in the heart of the city, marking the definitive, heartbreaking end of the golden age of the American department store. The physical disappearance of the Gimbel stores was merely the first phase of their erasure. As the dust settled in late 1986 and early 1987, the cities that had once been dominated by the towering limestone silhouettes of the Gimbel's palaces faced a surreal new landscape. In New York, the massive flagship at Herald Square, the very building that had dared to stare down Macy's for 3/4 of a century, was stripped bare. The once vibrant subterranean tunnels that had funneled thousands of commuters into the store were bricked off or repurposed, the direct artery to the city's heart suddenly severed. The building itself was eventually gutted, its architectural soul sacrificed to become the Manhattan Mall. A sterile, fragmented collection of smaller shops that never once recaptured the gravity or the cultural cohesion of the original department store. Across the country, the story was identical. The Gimbel's locations were either demolished to make room for generic office towers, subdivided into awkward, low-ceilinged retail spaces, or simply left as colossal, abandoned concrete carcasses that blighted suburban parking lots for years. The physical markers of a century of community history were wiped away with startling speed, as if the city planners and real estate developers were anxious to bury the evidence of what had once stood there. Yet, the true ghosts of Gimbel's are not found in the repurposed real estate. They exist in the collective memory of the American consumer, a ghost that haunts the current retail landscape. Gimbel's is remembered today as the final, grand representative of an era when shopping was a public, communal, and highly structured experience. They were the architects of the Thanksgiving Day Parade, the masters of the downtown destination, and the ultimate symbol of the middle-class dream. When the last door locked, it didn't just mark the end of a family business. It signaled the permanent fragmentation of the American retail experience. The collapse of Gimbel's provides a stark, enduring lesson in the fragility of institutional identity. Their fall was not sudden, nor was it inevitable. It was the slow, agonizing result of a failure to recognize that a brand is not a static object. It is a living, breathing contract with the consumer. By prioritizing short-term profit and corporate homogenization over their core mission of service, trust, and community, the leadership of Gimbel's dismantled the very things that made them essential. They became a shadow of themselves long before they actually closed their doors, proving that in the ruthless machinery of modern commerce, heritage and history are not bulletproof vests. They are simply the starting line. Today, the phrase, "Does Macy's tell Gimbel's?" has largely faded from the American lexicon, a linguistic relic understood only by older generations. But the story of their rivalry remains the foundational myth of New York retail. When shoppers today walk through the modernized, digitized, and highly optimized aisles of contemporary department stores, they are walking through the aftermath of the Gimbel's collapse. They are experiencing a world where the personal connection, the peddler's dream of Adam Gimbel, has been entirely replaced by algorithm-driven inventory management and automated efficiency. The Gimbel story is a mirror for the modern age. It is a haunting, multi-generational saga of how human pride, family ambition, corporate arrogance, and the relentless march of technological and demographic change collided in a way that destroyed a cornerstone of American life. As we look at the hollowed-out remnants of the modern shopping mall, the Gimbel story serves as a final, quiet warning. An empire that forgets its own identity, that abandons its core values for the lure of standardized convenience, is an empire that is already in the process of disappearing, long before the signs are ever taken down. The story of Gimbel's is a masterclass in the delicate psychology of consumer loyalty. For a century, the Gimbel family understood exactly what the American public desired, often before the public even realized it themselves. Adam Gimbel built a frontier empire, not just by selling dry goods, but by selling absolute trust. His sons built urban palaces, not merely to house inventory, but to engineer an environment where shopping felt like an aspiration, a reward, and a vital community event. They mastered the psychological theater of retail. But retail empires rarely collapse from a single catastrophic mistake. They fall through 1,000 tiny concessions. When the later generations of leadership stopped viewing their customers as a living, breathing community and started treating them as static demographic data on a balance sheet, the invisible bond was broken. When a corporate conglomerate like British American Tobacco applied industrial homogenization to a brand built entirely on emotional curation, they fundamentally misunderstood why people chose to walk through those heavy brass doors in the first place. A brand can vanish even if millions of people once loved it, because past affection cannot sustain a business that refuses to evolve alongside its patrons' changing psychological needs. When the last Gimbel's locations were liquidated and the signs were torn down, it wasn't just the loss of a store. It was the erasure of a shared cultural habit. It proves that in the relentless machinery of American commerce, your heritage and history might get you in the door, but only relentless, empathetic adaptation keeps you in the room. Today, the grand palaces of Herald Square are gone, their intricate window displays replaced by digital carts and algorithmic recommendations. Yet, the story of Gimbel's forces us to ask a lingering question. In our modern pursuit of hyper-efficiency and frictionless convenience, what magic of the human retail experience have we permanently left behind? Thank you for watching. Did you or your family ever shop at Gimbel's? Or do you remember a legendary local department store that anchored your own hometown? Share your memories in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want to explore more documentaries about the rise and fall of the empires that shaped American consumer culture, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications.